morning, good morning, good morning. Yes, it's the practicing Jew meeting the wandering Jew, having our conversation on a daily basis about whatever comes up. And whatever comes up is the thing we talk about and the thing we're introducing to you to talk about. Rabbi Levi Cunin, how are you this morning?
Thank God I'm doing good. It's good to see you, Rabbi Choel. I'm hoping and praying that this virus will be behind us very soon and we'll be on to new levels of beautiful heights and reality.
God willing, God willing, God willing.
Amen.
Well, we had a conversation yesterday about anti-Semitism. And I continued that conversation with several texts that I sent you. I'm not asking you to respond to the texts, but to continue the conversation. Because as I looked deeper into it and went online, I was truly stunned by how many extremely negative commentaries there are about Jews online. And it shocked me. Now hear me, I'm going on 84, I'm a Jew. I haven't hidden that I'm a Jew, but I've just never realized personally how much hostility, vitriol exists on the planet in plain sight. It's astonishing to me that they allow that to be published on YouTube, on Google, it's astonishing to me. So Levi, speak to me about that.
It is interesting. I think one of the reasons why many Jewish people don't experience that reality, one of them is because they're not necessarily noticeable to others that they're Jews. I recall when I first began Chabad of Malibu, on one of the Sabbaths that we were praying, there's one guy, I got him to come, finally to come. It was a beautiful story. And then afterwards, when we're having lunch, he walks over to me quietly. He says, "That guy's Jewish?" That guy was the guy sitting next to him, which was the president of the Bank of America locally, a Persian Jew. He said, "I thought that guy was a Muslim." So it's interesting because when we grew up like I did with a yarmulke, I got to experience anti-Semitism at a very young age, and actually I was and I always felt like I'm such a proud Jew. I felt bad for those people who that was what occupied their minds, their deep hatred. But the thing is like this, that unfortunately, as we have been discussing, number one, most Jews are not necessarily in an environment. If you live in America, you live in, for the most part, if you're not looking for it, you're not going to see what's going on. But it's actually pretty serious. It's getting even more serious. I'm not worried about it. Don't get me wrong. And there's a reason for that. But the point is that all one has to do is look at the United Nations. And that's a microcosm of what's going on in the world. And if you look at the unbelievable anti-Semitism, absolute anti-Semitism from that body, you get to see a microcosm of what is right now the consciousness of many people on our planet. Now, I'm not saying that they represent the majority. I do not believe that's the case. But the very fact that they could continue to perpetuate absolute total lies and to continue to denigrate and to insult our people the way they do is nothing less but anti-Semitism. People say it's anti-Israel. That's not true. It's just another way that it rears its ugly face, My grandparents my great-grandfather, he had a woman who was a big rabbi, and he was a head rabbi of Moscow, the chief rabbi of Moscow. He had a cleaning woman that worked for him, that her son was a leading priest, and he was the one that would dictate when the pogroms would happen. Hear me. A leading priest, a religious leader, was the one that was calling when and where the pogrom should take place. She was a righteous woman, his mother. As much as she tried, she could not get her son off of that dark, evil path. And thank God, whenever she found out there was a pogrom coming up, she would notify my great-grandfather. And such was the life for most of the last 2,000 years. For the Jewish people, not always everywhere, but there was always that going on over this period of time. And as I shared with you yesterday, I've really went into so many different avenues to try to understand the root of it. Doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I hear, they have these people who are anti-Israel. They have the BDS, a horrible organization that tries to squeeze Israel, that they should not be able to have export. And someone asked them, if Israel comes out with a vaccine for the virus, would you change your policy and allow your members to buy from Israel? And he said, if that happens, then yes, we will make it that everybody could buy it. Now just think about that, Here you have an acknowledgement that these people have the possibility, there is a likelihood that they're going to come up with something, because Baruch Hashem, that's part of the blessing that the startup nation, the modern Eretz Yisrael, is now a leader in technology. It's a small little country all over the world. So now why would somebody want to take out and destroy and obliterate a source of light like that? Well, it doesn't make any sense to me, And the only thing I would say is that, people equate it to the Star Wars. Remember that one? Were you into it? Star Wars?
No.
All right. So, Star Wars actually, believe it or not, is a mirror of a spiritual story. And there are forces out there. And we could talk about that, but that's the only thing that makes sense to me, is that number one, there are forces of darkness out there. And number two, the only way to really rid our world of that hatred is to be the light that we're meant to be. Because the only way to rid our world of darkness, as the Rabbi would often quote, the first Chabad Rabbi, is a little bit of light dispels a great deal of darkness. And I think we all see that when we interact with people who are not of the Jewish faith, but they get to see something different than maybe what they heard from people like haters like Reverend Wright, who spewed hatred from the pulpit for 20-something years, and instead get to have a interaction to see the beauty of the people who are called the children of Israel and the Jewish people. That's the only way to continue to be the light we're meant to be to the world. So that's my summary on that particular matter. I mean, I think there's many, many different things you could come into. You could say, what do you mean? Take a look at people like Jeffrey Epstein, they're a Shanda. And take a look at Madoff, he's a Shanda. These are the Jewish people. But you know what? You got to be a racist to define the Jewish people by the rotten apples.
Well, it's surprising to me that it's surprising to me. I've never experienced it at all, other than one time, and I shared that with you. That was when I was meeting with you and several other shluchim. And when I came to meet with you, I put a yarmulke on. And when I left, I took the yarmulke off. And so I thought one day, what would happen if I kept the yarmulke on? I'll never forget it. I was leaving the restaurant And that thought came to my mind, what would happen if I left the yarmulke on? And so I decided to leave the yarmulke on and see what would happen. And I would go on a speaking event and I'd wear the yarmulke. I'd be in the elevator and somebody would say to me, "Hello, Rabbi." And one day I was driving from my home past the University of San Marcos, and I suddenly noticed a car close up behind me and a car to my right close up beside me, and a car up in front slowing down. And then the men in the car began to yell, "Dirty Jew, dirty Jew, dirty Jew," to me. It never happened to me before. I shared that story with you, and you laughed when I shared it. You laughed because I was so shocked. I was so shocked, and you were laughing at the fact that here's your old friend Michael, who's so shocked that someone would say "dirty Jew" to him. And the only reason they did is because I was wearing a yarmulke. I'd never been identified as a Jew before. So to my shame, I took the yarmulke off. And I was passing by with my wife a hat store on the East Coast. And in the hat store, I saw this Panama hat. And I've been wearing it ever since. So it's my hidden Jew covering my head with something that nobody would claim to be Jewish. And it's my cowardice at standing out as being a Jew. Now here I'm saying this in front of everybody, whomever, whatever everybody is. It was astonishing to me, Levi. Astonishing to me. Never in all my education, in my grammar school, in my high school, I was never, ever referred to as a Jew. But then again, I never practiced being a Jew other than when I was bar mitzvahed.
And also it also has to do with where you grew up, because there were places in this country with people who are your age, like for example in Chicago, where they had entire neighborhoods where Jews were not allowed to move into those neighborhoods. Mm. So even in America, there was some blatant anti-Semitism, even to people who did not look like Jews on the outside necessarily, people who tried to blend in. But even so, there was plenty of anti-Semitism. I mean, and it still goes on, obviously. But, it's interesting. I grew up with stories with my ancestors defying the anti-Semites, you understand? And outwitting them and outsmarting them and having much more certainty in what they were about than the others had what they were about, And there's my own grandfather, my mother's father, he got tortured by the authorities because he was an overtly Jew, and he didn't go home and cry about it. He felt like he was standing up for something that's so important, and and he was like on fire. And those were the stories that I grew up with.
I got it.
So because of that, for me, I laugh at the anti-Semitism because it's like, yes, it's a very important part of our story,
Yeah, but you understand, he stood up for it because he was raised with it.
Correct.
I was raised with it. It was never a part of our story.
Understood.
Despite the fact that my mother was an active Jewess, but it was never part of our family's story. And because it was never part of our family story, a serious part of our family story, there was nothing there to stand up for. There was nothing that I believed in. It was never a part of my life. And so this conversation is a strange conversation for me to have. And had I not met you, had you not introduced yourself to me, we'd probably never be having this conversation. Had you not, with your fellow shluchim, contacted me and invited me to come talk to you about the e-myth, we'd never be having this conversation. And here we are. What can I say?
Yes, and that's pretty amazing to me. I have to kind of absorb that, because despite the fact of whatever I said, to think that someone could go through the years that you have gone through, Baruch Hashem, many more, and not have a deeper look at idea what's going on about anti-Semitism is interesting to me. It would be hard for me, and I know that you're a learned and an educated person, so it's not like,
No, wait a second. I just called myself an ignoramus. I read Jewish education in a link.
Yeah.
Yes, and it was just an amazing story about Jewish education. I'm not an educated person.
Well, I mean, you're well educated in the ways of the world, and to think that you're only coming to see the depth of anti-Semitism that's in our world today is interesting to me. It's something that's surprising to some degree. I would imagine that there are many, many, many others like you. At the same time, when the Rebbe sent out the shluchim, the Rebbe was never into those protests against anti-Semitism.
I'm closer.
The Rebbe's approach always has been, and something that is really an important part of all Chabad houses, is that our job is to bring a light to the nations. And as we bring a light to the nations, and what that means practically is that part of the Torah, I don't know that we've discussed this in detail, but I must have mentioned it. Part of the Torah is that Hashem gave guidelines to all human beings on what Hashem expects of the creatures that are referred to as human beings. Particularly, there are 7 instructions. Like, do not murder, do not steal. There's 7 of them. And it is the Jewish people's job to bring the light to the people of the world, to number 1, let them know that they are part of a living God, a God that cares about their choices, and that living God has given them guidance on what it is that is wanted of us. And that's our job, to bring a light and bring the spirit of it and bring the fact that every one of us could have an intimate relationship with Hashem. And I believe as we do that, the nature of anti-Semitism naturally goes away. I've seen it in anecdotal ways. I've observed it in bigger forms. And I believe that that's really, in my opinion, that's the only true remedy, is to be a light. So.
Yes. And frankly, that was what stimulated my thought about having this conversation. That light that you speak of could shine more brightly if it were more aware of the darkness that exists within, I'm calling them wandering Jews, but hiding Jews, Jews who have assimilated into the woodwork of their neighborhood to become something other than Jews.
Not by choice. Not necessarily by choice.
Well, but that is something that I'd put into question. I would say that yes, in many cases, in quotes, not by choice. A choice was never made. It was made for them. It was made by their parents. It was made by the people they associate with. They've just not been active Jews, never thought to be active Jews, never even thought to be Jewish. They're just one of the crowd. But beneath that, there is a choice. And I'm suggesting that beneath that, there is a choice. Beneath that, there was a choice that I made. I've never accepted the fact that I made the choice. But in speaking about it now, I know that there had to have been a choice of comfort as opposed to discomfort, choice of being a part of as distinct from being a part from. There was a choice. And that choice became a part of my life. Just like this hat became a choice. And so I think that that's an important conversation to have. I think it's an important conversation to have between us. But it's an important conversation to have between everyone. Every secular Jew. Every Jew on the planet. But in order to have that conversation with every Jew on the planet, we have to attract every Jew on the planet to engage in that conversation. And in some way, we have to learn how to do that. And it felt to me, and this is not my ego, in fact, it's as far from my ego as possible, it felt to me that in some way we could discover what that way is if you and I pursued it. And the only way to pursue it would be in a dialogue. But in an open dialogue that revealed each of us as we are, not as we wish to be thought of or seen as, but as we are in our lives, as hopefully we can do here, in a way that would open the conversation differently than the conversation that's been had. That was the thought I had. That's what stimulated me to do this. That if my reach into the business market could have any influence whatsoever, that it would be an exceptional thing if we could have that conversation with people who own businesses, Jewish people who own businesses, who aren't practicing Jews, who are, in quotes, secular Jews, or in our language, wandering Jews, in a way that would call them forth to say, this is an interesting conversation to have. That anti-Semitism isn't an imagination, it's a fact. And to avoid it, to essentially hide from it, It's a profoundly negative influence on what it means to be human. Whether from a Jewish perspective or from a Christian perspective, what it means to be human in this life. So, pardon me, that's what I thought this conversation was going to be about.
All right, well, I look forward to continuing it. I do believe that you're saying something very interesting. And yeah, let's continue the conversation. I know that we're running out of time now. So we'll continue, God willing.
Love you, Levi.
I love you too. You too. Have a beautiful day.
Thank you for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow in our onward search for what it means to be a wandering Jew, what it means to be a practicing Jew, what it means to be Jew at all here in America, here in the world. God willing, see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.